Chilean voters said no thank you to a new liberal constitution, and other nations are watching and scratching their head because they kind of thought this would be a slam dunk. Like, hey, here's a woke constitution that gives the government more power.
We've been hearing like that.
We thought that would go over without a hitch. So what happened?
This is the kind of stuff we hear about all around the world, that this is the way to go. This is the liberal new world order. This is the way we're going to go.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it seemed sort of like a wish list of everything that you would want if you lived in a peaceful society, but right? And so we're going to break down all those buts because it just, it turns out you can't really write utopia into a constitution. So it's such an interesting story, right? In a country of over 19 million people, over 12 million people turned out to vote against this new constitution, and politicians are super dumbfounded about it. The vote was clear, with over 62% of voters throwing this constitution in the trash. Now, the new constitution was born out of the 2019 Chilean protests. In 2019, the country went into a state of emergency, although protesters were mostly peaceful. Still, over 20 people died reportedly in places where the protests did become violent. They were protesting high costs of living and growing inequality, and they used a form of protest called cacerolazo, which is banging pots and pans. So, they wanted to be heard. They wanted a new government. They wanted a new system. They just didn't want this one. This is a really interesting case because Chile has a free market, and most utilities are run by private companies with very little government regulation. And this has helped Chile's economy grow steadily compared to other South American countries. But it has also led to inequality. So the government listened and said, okay, we will draft a new constitution. Now, it's interesting how the trajectory of this project went, because most of the country liked the idea of this. They gave their input. It started as a document that I think most moderate people would say, yes, they support those things. Indigenous rights, tribal designation, sure, gender parity, equality for access to utilities, things like that, right? But these are things that, like I would say, most moderate people want this, right? Like you would all agree on something like this.
Gender, again, no, I can't imagine you'd find someone who's like, yes, we want women to suffer.
Right.
Like, we want women to not be able to vote. We want women to not be able to drive their cars. Right. Like, I think we can all pretty much get behind that.
It didn't start as this sort of like super progressive movement, but it just started getting more and more liberal the more people sort of put their hands in the pot, right? Yeah. And for example, in Chile, there is currently no right to abortion, and this constitution did add some rights to abortion, but it didn't say rights for women. It was rights for people who gestate, right? Which is just indicative of how far this has come, and how far like they needed to appease a certain voter, or they felt like they did. They certainly didn't, right?
People who gestate, not women.
Right. And so political scientist Javiera Arce at the University College of London explained it this way to France 24 as to what happened.
What happened during the process? Firstly, we vote for new body with new actors of the political system. They were not politicians or professional politicians. They were people from the different social movements like water advocacy or even feminist movement, and they don't have enough experience doing politics, for example. And that, for that reason, the process during the constitutional convention was complicated, I think, in some terms, and was complicated to create positions or to create conjunctions between the different parts or the different representatives.
Right, so what do I hear from this? We had a pretty good plan, and then social special interest groups came in and mucked it up. Right.
Right. Because she says if it was hard for some of you to understand, it was hard for me to understand. But she had there was all these different social groups. You had feminists, You had like water conservation groups.
Yes.
You had like a bunch of all like sort of disparate groups, which, by the way, are in many ways, we'll talk about it later when you're done here, but this, like, they're all sort of being driven by the World Economic Forum and this agenda, these social pushes by the World Economic Forum. And so they're being pushed, but they don't really have any sort of political center. They don't have any political party that's going to marshal these forces.
Sure. You know, I think if you're going to start to write a constitution or like have any input on a constitution, you should study jurisprudence, right? Like minimum for writing a constitution. So you should not be taking input from people who are just sort of like special interest in terms of various disparate groups, right?
I mean, they should look at the United States, how we put together laws in the United States, right? It's all special interests. And that's how these laws, and they're an absolute mess. Look at Obamacare. It was literally just an amalgamation, like, you know, taking like cookie dough and sticking it all together with like all of these different special interests. And then it ended up being a giant pile of garbage.
Right. And so I think that most Chileans liked the idea of this. And then as the document came together, which the final document that was actually voted on was not finalized until July, they were like, no, this is not what we asked for. Now, maybe this would have worked had the pandemic not just happened, but it did. And after what we've collectively been through, who in their right mind would vote for a document that gives more power to any government, no matter how well liked they are? And that's exactly what this Constitution was about to do, because it was going to take certain utilities, water, for instance. Now, Chile is in a bad drought. And it was going to say, look, we can't have only the wealthy people buying up water rights. We need to distribute this to everybody. And so, you know, it had no backing of the business community that has been profiting nicely off of water rights and that kind of thing. Well, obviously, without the business community support, this was going to be suppressed, obviously. But again, the idea, I mean, I don't think anybody really feels like, oh, yes, let big business continue to thrive. We need to keep things, you know, power in their hands. But the alternative here is put everything in the government's hands. And after what we've all been through in the coronavirus pandemic, nobody wants that, right?
Right. It's consolidation of power. Again, this is the push. I mean, can I pull this up here? Let me pull up the World Economic Forum's website on Chile. Okay. They've been monitoring and working deeply with Chile to advance this agenda, right? So you can just you can see their whole section here on the inclusive growth in Chile. This is the World Economic Forum's page on Chile. Chile's gender gap, innovation and business sophistication in the energy sector, and mobility, entrepreneurship, corporate governance, education, skills, and learning. So all of these parts of their matrix at the World Economic Forum, right? And then if you want to ask the question, like if you go to Google and say, hey, is the WEF actually hurting Chile? Like their plans here? You have to dig all the way down. You can't even look at the search results are suppressed, as we know from World Economic Forum search results. Scrolling. You can't find anything negative about the World Economic Forum on Chile until you get even down maybe to TechCrunch's article about woke capitalism and how this is their new ideology for their economy in Chile and Argentina. And this is the World Economic Forum's plan for this fourth sector economy, which is woke capitalism, like TechCrunch calls them out about it.
Right. Well, it's interesting because Chile is a mining country, and if you look, even the Washington Post pointed this out recently, that Chile sits atop the world's largest lithium reserves. Mm-hmm. It produced about 25% of the world's commercial supply in 2020, and that's the reason that Western governments actually were like, we don't really need, you know, more government interest in terms of mining these reserves. We like dealing with private companies. So it's interesting that the Western influences were against this constitution, right? And I think, you know, is this a template for other countries to realize, oh, we can't just make a document, you know, that is well-intentioned and then sort of shove in our own political fluff, have politicians shove in what they want, much like most of the COVID relief packages that we got in the United States. Like, here's a little stimulus, but mostly this is stuff for my friends, right? Chileans sort of saw right through that. They liked the idea of this, but they were able to say, But no, this is a shift in power that we are not prepared for. There was a lot there that, for instance, they wanted to start an entire indigenous community, indigenous spaces with separate indigenous laws, much like what we already have in the United States, which would defer to Chilean courts if there were, if there was any conflict. And people just didn't really understand it and didn't want that and didn't seem to like that idea. Certainly there was a bit of like Brexit manipulation of voters going around, where some voters would get these social media posts saying, this constitution mentions indigenous people 200 times and Chileans 5 times, or something like that, right? So there was certainly manipulation of sentiment, sure. But I think that the Chilean government is saying now we will go back to the drawing board, but it could take years.
And it should take years. You're building a constitution for a country with millions of people. I mean, think how long it took the Constitutional Convention in the United States. We didn't have a constitution when we became the United States of America and the U.S., right? 1776, the Declaration of Independence. I don't think it was until, 1787 before they had a constitution that worked.
Right. It brings up this question is, how specific should a constitution be, right? So for instance, in the United States, the right to abortion was just rescinded because it is not specifically mentioned inside the Constitution, right? And so do we want broad strokes from a constitution, or do you want specific era-specific freedoms? For instance, this people who gestate, right? Is this something we are always going to use, or is this like an era-specific term that may, it's a big question that maybe we should take this on in another day. But as we continue to re-envision our society, because we see so many societies upended, and as we see this happen to the United States with the right to bear arms, the right to have an abortion, right? These types of things need to be, I don't know. I was watching this argument on Twitter today that most people are saying this is too specific. We need something that's more broad that guarantees freedoms and liberties and free market, not necessarily very specific, like you can live here, you get this education.
Yeah, a living, breathing document, right? That's supposed to be the Constitution that can be amended throughout time and grow, right? I mean, think about the amendments that were added later that, where we actually had actually gave women the right to vote.
Yes.
Think about the evolution of a document like that. So not everything needs to be spot on specific. I think the people who gestate stuff, and there's a whole bunch of other things inside here that were absolutely troubling.
Also, we see the way, they're billing it like, oh, too bad for you. You voted against the environment, Chileans, right? But we see how most governments write environmental regulation into law. And usually it's a way that disenfranchises poor people and limits access to energy for only the poorest, right?
Right.
And it's a huge shift of power. So was this bill really going to do that, or was it just political speak for how that could be done?
No, and I think this is, again, coming back to the World Economic Forum's plan for, globalization and a consolidation of power away from individual governments, and telling us where we're going to be on carbon, what we're going to do all of these things, and moving away from fossil fuels, driving economies into the ground. We're seeing it right now throughout Europe. Like, if you needed any more of an example, like why in the world would Chile sign on for that?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, it's fascinating to watch, and we will continue to watch as this develops, and whether or not they try a new document. It's interesting because now they revert to the Constitution they've had since their dictator days. And they're like, yeah, we're kind of okay with that. We'll keep what we have because at least we have a fairly stable economy, right? Even though their pension plan is a sham, and there are definitely problems like this celebrator that we showed you. Definitely there are still problems. They're not A-okay, but they are not willing to just take whatever, right?